And we have data binding. Data binding is the process of connecting a target such as DOM element, property, or event in a template to a model, data, or behavior in the component. This process let the template to dynamically reflect changes in the component state and execute actions based on user interaction, user template expression, or template statement. In Angular, data binding is used to establish the communications between the component class and the template and the component class. So there are two types of data binding. One-way data binding and two-way data binding. In one-way data binding, there are three types: property binding, attribute binding, and then event binding. The first one is one-way data binding. In one-way data binding is one access interactions between the component and its template. The data flow either from component to its corresponding template or template to the component. If you perform any changes in your component, then it will reflect in the HTML element. So one-way data binding can be achieved through the following ways: text interpolation, event binding, property binding, and attribute binding. The first one is text interpolation. Text interpolation is a process of formatting or manipulating strings. In Angular, it is used to display data from a component to a view. In this way of data binding, we use the curly braces. And then event binding. Event binding is the process of setting an action to the event of an HTML element or another component. It is used to achieve one-way data binding, where data flows from the view template to the component layer. Here we have now used the parameters. Given an action like mouse click, double click, or any other keyboard and mouse action, the user interacts with applications and performs an action when an event will be realized. Next one is property binding. Property binding refers to the property of a DOM. It is used to show or hide a DOM element and simplify manipulate the DOM. Here we have to use square bracket. The next one is attribute binding. Attribute binding is used to bind the data from component to HTML attributes. Another text interpolation. So the text interpolation is a process of using data of Angular components in its corresponding template using the template expression. It is used just to display a piece of information in HTML, such as displaying a title or name. The component is a building block of an Angular application. It consists of a TypeScript class, HTML template, and CSS slider. The template expression is a piece of code printed within the other curly braces in the template. Here, how to use the text interpolation. This is the syntax of the text interpolation. Let us consider that the component has a name as one of its property. Here we give the name as John So now we can be used in the template as shown below. Hello mail. So list the output as hello John. We have to understand the template expressions. So template expressions are same as that of JavaScript expression, excluding two sets of expressions. Expression with no usage in the template, expression with side effect. For example, the increment operator basically increment the given variable and then return the increment value. This is called side effect. Since the increment operator produces the side effect, it is not allowed in the template expression. So these are the some of the JavaScript expressions not allowed in the template expression. First one is assignment operator, new keyword, type of and instance of keyword, checking expression, increment and decrement operator, and then final one is preface operator. So in assignment operator, template does not have the concept of creating a new variable and setting value for it in the contents of template. In the new keyword, template does not allow the creation of new object. Any object should be created in the component class. So object created in the component will be available in the template. In type of an instance of keyword, template does not allow interpretation of the object in the template. So the object should be built in the component to the complete method and should expose to the template. Then chaining expression. Template expressions allow only a single expression and so all chaining operators are excluded. An increment and decrement operator. Template does not allow the side effect. Since the increment and decrement operator, this side effects are excluded. The last one is preface operator. Here we have to use the pipe symbol to represent the angular pipe concept. Angular pipes are used for text transformation. Next one is template expression container. Template expression has three contents. First one is components property. Component properties are the property set in the component instance. For example, a user object in the component can be used in the template as follows. Here, user contains is a component instance. Second one is template input variable. So the template input variable or the input to the template assigned through directives. For example, NG4 directive send the index and the current item of the root to the template as shown below. So this is the example. Here user content is a template input variable. Third one is template reference variable. So the template reference variable is basically template representation of HTML elements. Here we have to give the component and directives. So the precedence of the content in place of the name position is as follows. Template variable, variable in the directive contents, and then components member variable. So this is the working example of text interpolation. First you have to create the new application. Given the command ng new Maya. Step 2, you have to create the component. Step 3, open the component file and then add a variable name user with value John. In step 4, you have to open the component template file and then add the element. In step 5, you have to open the component template file and add the component. So in step 6, open the add component file and add the component as shown below. So finally, you got the output like this. So text interpolation is easy to learn as it uses the JavaScript expression. Since the text interpolation does not allow the script tag and allow only the expressions with no side effect, the text interpolation will help you create safe and secure web application. The next one is event binding. Angular provides option to listen and file action for each user instantiated even in a typical web application. Event binding is the process of targeting an event in HTML element or component and a set of responders for the target event. Responder will execute once the event is fired. An event can be set from an HTML element by including the event name inside the bracket and assigning the template statement. The template statement will execute once the event is fired by the user. So this is the syntax of the event binding. You have to give the event name equal to, then you have to give the template statement within the double quotes. The second one is syntax for the event of a pattern. So there are various type of events used in the Angular. So Angular support all events in the web applications, and the events are categorized by source and usage. The types of event are as follows: mouse event, keyboard-based event, touch-based event, document-based event. So the first one is mouse-based events. The mouse-based events are events fired by the mouse actions like click, scroll, movement, drag. Some of the important events in this category and its annual event binding target names are single click, double click, mouse up, mouse entering the element, mouse leaving an element, scrolling a block, holding and dragging the element, holding and dropping an element, then dragging an event over the target block. Second one is keyboard-based event. Keyboard-based events are the event fire and the user works on the keyboard. So some of the most important events in the keyboards are pressing a key down, releasing a key up, pressing a character key press, focusing an element, focus, then opposite of focusing element, burning. So specifying the pressing a specific key or key combination like shift plus key. The next one is touch-based event. So the touch-based events or events where when the user interacts through a touch device. Some of the most event in this category are as pointing an element and start moving in a touch device, such as touch start, and then pointing an element and moving in a touch device, touch move. Then pointing an element and start moving in a touch device, touch journey. The next one is web document-based event. So web document-based events are specific events fired in the web document. It performs actions like copy and paste, text, submitting a form, etc. Some of the most important events in this category are submitting a form by clicking the submit button, copying the text to the clipboard, pasting the text from the clipboard, editing and copying a piece of text to the clipboard. Event binding simplifies event-based programming in a typical web application. It allows the keyboard, mouse, and touch devices. Provides the detailed information of the target elements and this event. The next one is property binding. So property binding is a type of data binding in which we bind a property of a DOM. Its purpose is to show or hide a DOM element or simply manipulate the DOM. It helps to set a value for the property of the HTML element or Angular component. The data binding is a mechanism that allows flow of data between the component class to the template and template to the component class. The next one is how to use the property binding. So to use the property binding, we enclose a property of an HTML element or component within a square bracket. As shown below, here the value of the property is basically a template variable. By generating the view from the template, Handler will set the value of the property by processing the template variable. Property binding provides option to set dynamic values for HTML element and component. Suppose the Boolean property as well. It's quite easy and finished in 2 days. Next one is attribute binding. Attribute binding helps to set the value for the attribute of the HTML element. Handler exposes attribute of the HTML element with a matching property with the attribute name converted into the camel case. For example, constant attribute corresponding Angular properties constant. Even though Angular failed to provide all the HTML element attribute as property, it still uses some of the attribute of SVG element, modular element, etc. We can use attribute binding when the attributes of the HTML element is not available as a property. Also, we can use attribute binding for attribute of all the HTML elements. Attribute binding enables the developer to set dynamic value for the attribute of the any HTML element, even for elements which will be defined in the future. So this is the difference between property binding and then attribute binding. Here the property binding binds to the property of the DOM element. Here attribute binding binds to the attribute of an element. It is used to bind the property that can change dynamically like DOM properties. It is used when you need to bind attributes that do not have corresponding properties of the element. Directly update the DOM property. It affects the attribute value but does not directly affect the DOM property. Then Angular class. A dynamic web application usually have dynamic strings and also during the runtime of the application. So class binding is a special value to bind the dynamic value to the class as attribute of the HTML element. So these are the ways to use the class binding. Angular provides 4 different ways to implement the class binding. Each of them supports a special feature. So the 4 ways are single class binding, single class binding with on and off feature, multiple style binding, and multiple style binding to an object on and off feature. So class binding enables the developer to set the complex value for the class attribute of the HTML element easily through either string or the custom object. The Angular style binding. Dynamic web application usually have a dynamic state and also during the runtime of the application. Style binding is a special binding to bind the value to the style attribute of the HTML element dynamically. So these are the ways to use the style binding. Single style binding with unit, multiple style binding, multiple style binding to the custom style object. The first one is single style binding. Here the property name of a CSS style should be applied to the style string and should be surrounded by the square bracket. Style binding with unit, the property name of a CSS style should be appended to the style string. The unit here should be appended to the property name of a CSS style and should be surrounded by the square bracket. In the multiple style binding, the style string should be surrounded by the square bracket and the value should have proper field constraints. The last one, the style string should be surrounded by the square bracket and the value should be set within the object of type record. Style binding enables the developer to set complex value of style attribute of any HTML element easily through either plain style or custom style objects. Last one is two-way data binding. So two-way data binding is a two-way interaction where the data flows in both the ways from component to views and view to the component at the same time. If you do any changes in your property, then it reflects in your view and vice versa. So it is a combination of property and event binding. So Here we have to implement the two-way data binding like this, using NG model or using custom event and property binding. The first one is NG model. So the NG model is a directive that is used for two-way data binding between the component class and the HTML template. It helps to sync the data between the model in the component and the view in the template. This directive is commonly used on forms such as input, text area, and select to bind it to the component property. If the user interprets the input field of a form, the value of an input is automatically updated in the component property. Similarly, if the component property is changed by any, the input field is automatically updated to reflect the new value. So this is the syntax for the two-way binding using NG model. So that's all about data binding.